Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this 2023 annual symposium. Normally, being titled the Geopolitical Economic Symposium, we have with us heads of states, ministers, experts from the globe. We have one of them with us because he will represent the entire globe. But when it comes to today's discussion, there is no way to have anything discussed in Israel today without having the big elephant with us. And the big elephant is the subject that has kept all of us at home and abroad very, very occupied, because the future is long ahead of us, and therefore whatever we do today will prove to be a very meaningful investment. Those of you who are coming to our university on an annual basis, I bet that in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, when your children will ask you, where were you during the most important year in the life of modern Israel, during 2023, you will be able to say, I was at Tel Aviv University. And the reason is because that's where things are happening in this critical junction. In fact, this is a critical week and a critical date. 3 days ago, 75 years ago, plus 3 days, the State of Israel was declared. At midnight, between May 14th and May 15th, 1948, the British Mandate ended and the State of Israel was declared, and the War of Independence also followed. And this shaped us for the subsequent 75 years. I truly believe that the debate today, if successful, not if, since it will be successful, will shape our lives for the subsequent 75 years. Today, 56 years ago, Jerusalem was unified, and this is why we declared this day to be Jerusalem Day. As you can see, when history is moving on a fast-forward mode, things are happening on a daily basis. And being here, you are all going to be part of it. Let me tell you our agenda. We have with us 4 of the leading scholars and practitioners in the field that we are going to discuss. Each one of them will have some opening remarks. Of course, our distinguished guest, Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam from Singapore, because the name is so long, he will have an extra minute or two. And I will not ask him to pronounce it itself because it will waste those 2 extra minutes. And then it will be followed by our president, Professor Ariel Porat. Let me just say, and I will not waste words at this stage because of time, but he has done a spectacular job during an extraordinary challenging times. Yesterday, we heard his speech to the opening plenary of the Board of Governors with the State of the University statement. Many people said, wow. And indeed, we have with us now also the chairperson of the Board of Governors, Mrs. Daphna Meitar. And I think that with this team and the rest of the leadership, with our Friends Association, with Mr. Amnon Dick, and everyone else, we are in safe hands. So let's see how we can navigate all of this. So the agenda is Senior Minister Tharman, I'll call him like that for that purpose, will tell us about the global scene, the geopolitical challenges, the geoeconomic challenges. Do we have the instruments to deal with the new realities? And what can a country like Israel, he will not need to mention the name Israel, but a country like Israel, do in order to create resilience in this uncertain world? But I cannot just invite him to the podium without telling you something about him, a very dear personal friend and a friend of Israel. And tonight he will be bestowed with the highest prize, the George Wise Medal. But the truth has to be said, he is here because of his international stature. He is now the senior minister in Singapore, where before this he was Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Coordinating Minister for Social Policies, Minister of Education, the Singaporean government, in short. And the world institutions have recognized his capabilities, and therefore he has been chairing important commissions of the UN. He's also a chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Group of 30, after serving a term as chairman and CEO of the Group of 30. He has been recruited, so to speak, by the G20 to head critical commissions. In short, he's a man that people seek his advice, and his authority will be seen to you very soon. He is a graduate of the London School of Economics, of Cambridge, Harvard, you name it, whatever one needs. In the context of domestic policies, he is also the chairman of the Monetary Authority of Singapore and vice chair of the GIC, the Government of Singapore Investment Arm. So with these opening remarks, and I will introduce the rest of the speakers as we move on, I will ask Tharman, please come to the podium, take 10 minutes, and I give you 11 in fact if you need them, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for inviting me to join you. And this is working well, right? I was told to speak close to the mic. Let me, given the severe constrictions of Jacob's time allocation, jump straight into it. Our central task, wherever we are, is to build resilience and optimism in a fundamentally unstable era. I say fundamentally because we're not just dealing with bad actors. We do have bad actors, but we're not dealing with bad actors or black swan events or just the idiosyncrasies or vagaries of global affairs. We're dealing with a fundamentally new set of forces that are now embedded in the system. Forces that are leading systematically to disorder and to the fracturing of society, domestically, as well as the fracturing of global society. We can build resilience and optimism in this fundamentally unstable era, but it requires economic, social, and political adaptations, and it requires both national and global action. And I would spend the remaining 10 minutes of my allocation talking first about the meta theme, the basic shift from a broadly stable to an inherently unstable world, before talking very briefly about the sorts of adaptations that we need. So the broad theme, think of what we've seen since the turn of the century. 3 pandemics, the last of which being the worst in living memory. 1 major global financial crisis, but several other major financial shocks. A major war in Europe, the first since the end of the Cold War. Several other wars, not to be forgotten. An upsurge in conflict within Africa that doesn't make the headlines, but is horrendous in its consequences, including forced migration and now the real risk of a return of large-scale famine. And most importantly, the existential risks that we now face that show up as shocks, the climate extremities, the worst heat wave in living memory, which happened to be in China, the worst drought in Europe in 500 years, extreme floods, often in the same places that were hit by drought, and there's science behind that, but basically an increasing frequency and intensity of environmental extremities. We're not dealing with chance events, random events, or a stochastic pattern. We are dealing with a systematic pattern of events. Essentially, the Earth system has shifted from a broadly stable state of affairs to an unstable state of affairs. And we are seeing the global unraveling of a system of rules that preserved an open global order. And thirdly, less defined, it's not something you could put your hands around so easily, but is fundamental, which is the loss of trust, both within societies and globally. A loss of trust that shows up in all the surveys that are done. Edelman, Pew Global Research, all the surveys show a systematic downtrend in trust in institutions, in politics, in the media, as well as in the global system. We have to focus, therefore, not on the shocks and disruptions and extremities, but on these slow-moving changes, the slow-moving undercurrents and unravelings that show up as crises and disruptions. Second, we have to recognize that we are dealing with non-linearities, negative feedback loops, and ultimately, possibly, regime shifts. There's no reversion to the mean. This is not what economists and financial analysts are familiar with, where a cycle eventually returns to a mean. Value eventually returns to its proper value. There's no reversion to the mean. First, on the environment, the science is very clear. We are crossing tipping points. And when you cross those tipping points, you get irreversible change. Irreversible change, the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the warming of the northern forests or the boreal forests, and very worryingly, the increasing savannaization of tropical forests, with what's happening in the Amazon being at a very early stage. The Amazon forest could become a savanna. Once you cross these tipping points, you get a cascading set of changes, which scientists are unable to predict or quantify very easily. One tipping point leading to another, cascading changes and irreversible change. So remember, we are dealing not just with instability, but non-linearity. It's not just environmental, it's also social and political. There is such a thing as path dependence in political developments. When you think of what's happening today, the growing polarization in society and in politics in many parts of the world, including, as far as the surveys are concerned, in the most advanced democracies. In fact, if you look at the Edelman survey, just came out about a month ago, the most severely polarized countries now include the United States, Sweden, surprisingly, and Spain, advanced democracies. And the countries at risk of becoming severely polarized include France, Italy, UK, Germany, Japan, advanced countries. Once you get into a polarized state, it tends to feed on itself. Polarization feeds distrust, and distrust feeds into polarization. Path dependence, non-linearity, no reversion to the mean. Economic development, too, involves the same risk of not reverting to the mean, but a regression that continues. Because each time you have a major shock, we've seen it with COVID, we saw it with the global financial crisis, you're not just suffering for a few years and then you hope to catch up by faster than normal growth. Even the trajectory of growth changes. There's a change in the slope, in other words. The trajectory of growth changes. And finally, we're dealing with the confluence of all these things at the same time. The slow-moving environmental shifts in the Earth system, the changes that are fundamentally occurring in society and politics, the changes that are happening in economic development, the changes that are happening in global health, because the pandemics are coming. They're baked into the system. We're now dealing with a confluence that's not just a confluence of idiosyncratic events, but a structural confluence that's going to be with us for some time to come, which I will therefore call a perfect long storm. Not a perfect storm, but a perfect long storm. And we have to address this with a few reorientations in the way we think about public policy, nationally and globally. And I'll be very brief now. First, focused on the undercurrents, not the shocks. Prepare in advance. Prevent the shocks from happening. And if we can't prevent them altogether, prepare in advance to minimize the scale of shocks. We failed badly on COVID, but we were probably lucky on COVID compared to what the next pandemic will be. So prevention and preparedness, nationally and globally, requires far more resources and coordination. If we only wait for a crisis to occur and respond to it when it occurs, it's dramatically more costly, and in the case of global health, of course, the cost is also dramatically greater for human life. There is no way of, we cannot accept the idea that on the environment, where we are way behind the race, we can't accept the idea that, well, we're going through great difficulty now. Don't worry, we'll catch up later. We understand the science, we understand what needs to be done. We're going to do it later. There's no catching up because the science doesn't allow a catch-up. Once you cross tipping points, you get irreversible change. And the amount of catch-up required later is far more daunting, economically and politically. So we have to get moving now. Think long-term, first to save costs, but second to have a chance of avoiding a real existential catastrophe. Think in some ways of the way you have solved water in Israel, addressing the necessity squarely in the face that you're going to be increasingly short of water, innovating, finding solutions, scaling them up. That's what Singapore has done too. Necessity has to force invention and solutions. Think in those terms for all the major challenges we face. Second reorientation, macroeconomic policy, a world that Jacob and I inhabit, unfortunately. The basic game of macroeconomic policy in a world that's not just about cycles around some stable secular path, but a world of shocks, of increasing intensity and frequency. The basic game of macroeconomic policy has to be to build up buffers in normal times rather than allow for a build-up of risks in normal times. And what we've seen in both monetary and fiscal policy has, in the last decade and a half, been a very significant build-up of risks after crises and before the next crisis. I would unfortunately have to say that what's happened in monetary policy after the global financial crisis has been one of the largest mistakes in macroeconomic policy in decades. We've allowed for a very significant build-up of risks, and we're now beginning to pay the price of it. Not just inflation, but the price in financial instability, and in fiscal policy, the price to be paid by the next generation. Third reorientation, we have to put a lot more store by collective action. Not one nation acting on its own, not one group within a nation acting on its own, because the nature of the problem is collective to begin with. The fundamental problems we face have been caused by collective actions, and the solutions have to involve collective action. And think of it as an opportunity, because if you think of the challenges of the environment, the daunting challenges of the environment and the much larger scale of investment required, vastly larger than we've invested in the past, it's actually a huge opportunity for growth. By any rough calculation, if we make these investments, we will be growing globally by about 20 to 25% faster than we've done in the last 2 decades, with the developing world seeing an even larger increment. It's an opportunity for growth and inclusive prosperity, including the regeneration of regions far away from the largest metropolitan cities, because the places where you get sun and wind are typically quite far from the metropolitan cities. Fourth shift, we need a new modality in multilateralism to prevent a multipolar world from becoming a polarized world. And the largest responsibility rests on the major powers, in particular the US and China, but everyone has to be part of this game. Finding a new modality in multilateralism that accepts the fact that we are in a multipolar world, but prevents it from becoming polarized. And it needs a lot less zero-sum thinking in economic competition, technological competition, and in the competition to raise productivity. We have to compete in ways that prevent the fracturing of the global trading and investment system. That's a fourth shift. And find common ground between the US and China and everyone else. Find common ground in addressing our largest challenges, which have to do with the global commons. Fifth and final shift in how we build resilience and optimism comes back home. Because we cannot avoid global polarization if we are polarized domestically. That is true in the United States, it's true everywhere. We cannot resist that trend towards a polarized and fractured global order if we are polarized and fractured domestically. And that requires, of course, economic dynamism and the whole set of policies to sustain economic dynamism, because that's what social order, cohesion, and mobility depend on. But it also requires thinking hard about trust. Pew Global Research did one of the best surveys of the state of trust after COVID. Most societies ended up more divided and less trustful of each other within their societies following COVID. Singapore was one of the very few that ended up far more united after COVID. Most societies ended up more divided and less trustful after COVID. But the fundamental issue is this: you cannot summon up trust in a crisis. You can't switch on trust in a crisis. You've got to build it continually. You've got to build it continually through your economic policies, your social policies, your education policies, and your politics. Constant communication, constant feedback, constant listening. Trust cannot be summoned up when you most need it. It has to be continually developed in our politics, in our economic policies, in our social policies. I end there, but let me just say as a final word, we have a window of opportunity that's finite. It's not very wide. We have a window of opportunity that we have to move and build momentum along each of these reorientations. We can't reinvent multilateralism or reinvent our domestic polities within 2 or 3 years in most instances. But we've got to create momentum and build optimism in that momentum so that people get some faith in directions that are leading to the public good and better lives for themselves. Build momentum, move with urgency, and make these achievable shifts while we still can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We move on immediately to, to Professor Ariel Porat. Ariel wears here two hats at least. One, he is the president of our university, and he has had to struggle with a fundamental question. Should a leader of a university that serves a broad range of views of faculties and students, should he jump into the arena of public debate, or should he stay in the ivory tower and do this or that? And I know that Professor Porat has struggled with this issue because it is a fundamental one, but I also know that very early on he reached the decision that this time is different. And one of the issues that I hope he will share with us is how did this process come about? But the second hat that he wears, and maybe the first one in fact, is an extraordinarily high reputation scholar in the legal field. He has been the dean of the law school, and some of the discussions about the so-called judicial reform, which has become from then onwards to be the overall of the judicial system, some of the issues are very technical, very detailed. Many people have a view, not knowing exactly what it is about, and occasionally you lose the trees, you lose the forest from so many trees. But there is one major tree that if you understand this, you have made it most of the way. And Ariel will tell us which one is this tree. Okay, Ariel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacob. So let me start by a very brief overview, kind of a legal overview for those people who are less familiar with the law in Israel. I will do it in 2 minutes because I don't want to keep the 10 minutes limit. So generally in Israel, as you know, there are 3 branches. The judiciary, there is the legislative one, and there is the executive. But in Israel, in fact, the Knesset is in a way controlled by the government. So some would say that we have only 2 branches. Like substantively, we have 2 branches. For that reason, independent judiciary is especially of importance. Also, we do not have constitution. So when people compare us to the United States, this is a terrible mistake because in US, they have constitution, they have 3 branches, and also they have 2 houses, and there are state judges, etc., etc. So it's completely incomparable to what's going on in Israel. Now, against this background, the Israeli Supreme Court developed the power through the years to be very critical and to be able to criticize and to supervise some acts of the government and even sometimes to repeal laws of the Knesset, even though it does it very, very rarely, like less than once in a year at average. But it really gained power through the years, and some people don't like it, and I even understand some of that. You know, some objections are reasonable, and I want to say that some reform is not needed. But we'll get to it later. Now, in Israel, there is also an appointment committee that appoints judges, and it's a kind of a balanced committee. Part of it is completely apolitical, and part of it is political, and there should be not a consensus, but out of 9 members, there should be at least 7 to support an appointment to make an appointment possible. Now, what the reform is about. So I don't have enough time to talk thoroughly about the modifications to the law that are proposed by the coalition or by the government. Generally, it's about dramatically weakening the power of the Supreme Court to supervise the government and also the Knesset. But I want to focus only on one modification. There are many others, which is the most crucial one and the most troubling one. And this is about the way in which judges would be appointed if this reform is enacted. And the general idea, the original idea, now there are all kinds of variances to that, but the original proposal was that the appointment committee would be controlled by the coalition. So out of 11 members, 6 would represent the coalition. So put it simply, the prime minister would be able to appoint any judge in Israel. I say judge and not justice, because not only justices of the Supreme Court, but each and every judge in Israel would be appointed by the coalition. Now, as to justices, it means making the Supreme Court very political, but in one direction. When it comes to the lower courts, magistrates, and the district court, it's not only about politicizing the judiciary, it's also about lowering dramatically the professional quality of judges. Why? Because there is a notorious practice in Israel, unfortunately, or a culture in Israel, that politicians, when they want to reward their supporters after the election, they give them jobs. Where are the jobs? Public offices. So imagine what happens if the coalition, actually the prime minister, is able to appoint each and every judge in Israel. It means that many supporters of politicians would be awarded by being appointed to be a magistrate judge or a district court judge. Now, this is not about right and left. It has nothing to do with right and left. Think about yourself, whatever party you support. Suppose you have a problem one day with a license that for some reason has not been granted to you, or maybe denied for some reason, or think about you want to have some engagement with an officer, or some a neighbor dispute or whatever, and then you go to court. And it doesn't matter whether you are right or left. And then it happens that the judge, the magistrate court judge, that has to decide whether to grant you the remedy that you require, is not on the right party, and he would just won't do it because actually he's subordinated indirectly to the minister or to the government. So these kind of things might happen, and it happens in many countries in the world, which we really don't want to be like those countries. These are not democratic countries. We don't want to be there. Okay, so this is generally about the risk of the judicial, the changing the composition of the appointment committee to make the prime minister, in fact, being able to appoint any judge that he or she likes, and also to the Supreme Court. Now to the main point I want to make in the rest of the time which is left. And this is what the role of universities or university leaders in such situations. So first of all, let me say that I think that the principle should be neutrality of academic leaders, as opposed to faculty, to professors. They shouldn't be natural. Part of the academic freedom is to speak and to talk about anything, and as long as it's not for a capture audience, namely you cannot you cannot bring politics into your classroom unless it's relevant. Sometimes it's relevant, right? If you study constitutional law, of course, it's relevant to talk about these kind of issues. But if you, say, teach in the Faculty of Engineering, you cannot take a capture audience and make them, listening to your political views. But as long as it's out of the class, that's academic freedom. You can talk about anything you like. But academic leaders should be more cautious, and it's obvious why, right? We have students and the faculty and administrative staffs, and then belong to all parts of society. They have their own political views, and I always want to be the president of all students, of all faculty, and of all the staff of the university, and I know very well that once I'm identified with a political party, by definition it's bad. So the principle of neutrality, I respect it. I think it's really important. But as to any other principle, also here there are exceptions. And I want to mention 3 of them because all of them are relevant. The first one, which is obvious, when it's about your own institution, right? If the government wants to cut your budget, of course you are expected as a president to try to change the decision and to do whatever is good for your institution. This is obvious. Or if it's also about academic freedom more generally, this is your job to protect your university, sometimes the entire academia, for infringement upon academic freedom. The second exception is about human rights liberties, and human dignity. Here too, in my view, you could not keep silent. You should speak out if in your own country the government or anybody else infringe upon people's liberties. And the third one, it is when there is a threat to the democratic foundation of your country. With all due respect to the principle of neutrality, sometimes this principle should withdraw in the face of other important values that cannot and should not be compromised. Now, let me tell you a very brief story about what Tel Aviv University has done in the last 4 or 5 months, and then you'll see how those exceptions that I've just mentioned are reflected in what the university has done and what I have done myself. So it started after the election, before any government has been established yet, when there's some extremist Knesset members later became ministers of the current government, declared that their ambition is to modify the law and to enable discrimination for consciousness reason, that's the way they called it, consciousness reason, and to change the law that providers of services would be able to refuse to provide services or even products. For example, if a medical doctor thinks that he would prefer not to provide medical care to a member of the LGBT community, he would be able to refuse to provide such services. So if people don't want to serve the, say, Arabs for some consciousness reason, that would be possible. This is a terrible discrimination. No democratic country in the world could tolerate such discrimination. So after that initiative came out from those extremists, and I must say that from the coalition or the future coalition, as far as I know, nobody say this is ridiculous, this is something we oppose. They said nothing, just accepted it without any reaction. I published a letter to the campus, and also it came to the press, that on behalf of Tel Aviv University, that's what I've said, we would never collaborate with any entity, not collaborate, not contract with any entity in Israel or in any other place in the world that would discriminate, regardless whether it's lawful or not. So what we have said is that even if that law is enacted, Tel Aviv University, put it simply, would not obey such a law. And we were the first public institution to do it. 2 hours later, the mayor of Herzliya, a student at Bloomberg Sagol new mayor's program held at Tel Aviv University. Anyway, that's not irrelevant, just a way to promote the program. But so the mayor of Herzliya was the second one after us to have the similar declarations, and then some others followed. So that was the first occasion I wanted to point out to. Now then, you know, the government has been established, and the legal reform, or what we call constitutional revolution, has been set on the table. And there was an opposition from faculty, there were demonstrations, and I actually encouraged what I called being an activist. I've said whatever your view here is, even if you are for the reform, say what you think. That was directed to faculty. Now, not so surprisingly, most of the people that were activists were against the reform, but the idea was that in such a critical moment in my view, to the democratic continuation of Israel, it's very important that people would not be passive. Say what you think. Fight on your views. It's not time to be passive. And there was many faculty here, more than in any other university in the world, in the country, became very activist, expressed their views, and that was, I think, very good. It's kind of an exercise in democracy. Now then, there was a second point, which is very crucial. In that point, the Israelis here might remember that one of the people who was still leading the constitutional revolution, Symmagaratnam, a member of the Knesset, watched a TV interview with with Mandelblit. Mandelblit is the former Attorney General in Israel. And the Attorney General was critical on the government. Believe me, no more than just being critical on the government, nothing else. And then Symcha-Rotman, this is a very senior person, and he says he should be jailed for what he has said. And he repeated it 3 times in 3 different interviews. And even more disappointing, nobody from the government said anything. Some of them even supported him. Most of the others just kept silent. Then, that was a point in which even as a law professor, I thought that's something I could not tolerate. I cannot, I have a hat, as Jacob said, as a president, but also as a law professor. So I published this letter, I sent this letter, it also came to the press, and it was Saturday. Excuse me, those people who keep Shabbat, even sometimes we are Chilul Shabbat, sometimes it's something that we should do. Anyway, why I say Shabbat or Saturday? Because the demonstrations are always here in Tel Aviv on Saturday night. So I've sent a letter saying, watch this TV interview and understand what's going to happen in Israel if we would not have an independent judiciary. People like Mandelblit and me too might be jailed, and there would not be any recourse to courts. That's what's going to happen. And then I wrote something that I've never done before. I said, I'm going to the demonstration today. And I call you to do the same. And I say, and I also say to them, talk to your students before too late. And then that was kind of, the Minister of Education didn't really like it, but this is our life. Then the third and last point I wanted to mention was at that unforgettable day when Netanyahu actually fired or actually announced about his intention to fire the Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense. That was the Sunday that hundreds of thousands of Israelis spontaneously went to the street, demonstrated, and then we conveyed all the university presidents together through Zoom, and they made a decision that I would have never dreamt about making, but I was, to say the truth, one of the most adherent supporters of this decision, that the universities should go to strike. Well, we didn't use the word strike, stop teaching. Because we say, regardless of what you think about this political reform, this judicial reform, even if you think that it's a good idea in abstract, this is not a price worth paying. You cannot do such a thing. You cannot punish the Minister of Defense just because he warned us from the external threats to Israel because of the judicial reform. Actually, the Minister Gallant say that he supports the revolution, but he says very bravely that this is not a price worth paying because of the external threats. So that was also the point that the labor union went to strike, and actually the government decided to halt the revolution, and now, as you know, it's under the president. Let me say just really last word. Some people ask me, okay, you are a law professor, and you think that you know that what the government wants to do, it's very bad to democracy. But other people think otherwise. This is a terrible mistake. I'll tell you why it's a terrible mistake. Yes, some people think otherwise, many people think otherwise. But what people, in my view, do not understand, that this is a professional question. It's a matter of expertise. Through the COVID, when doctors say, vaccine yourself, most of us just did it, even though we do not understand what is exactly the biological process in our body when we take the vaccine. Because this is very common that we trust experts. Doctors know, and we trust them, we should trust them, otherwise what can we do? We trust scientists. That's what we have learned from the COVID crisis. Same thing here. People think that when it comes to law or when it comes to social science, every argument could go. This is a mistake. And let me finish by saying, I know quite well the Israeli Legal Academia. Trust me, there is no one serious a professionally serious professor in Israel, unless if he's not committed to democratic values. This is another thing. Remember, also in a dictatorship could be very good lawyers. But I don't know even a single professor in law that support the revolution, at least in its original form. There are many people, including myself, that think that some changes should be made, but none of them would support so it's a kind of a professional issue, and you should ask yourself, if there is even, if you believe me, that there is not even one serious professor in law, and the same thing also with political science, that would support the revolution, this should really bother us. And the fact that many others think otherwise, you know, it's exactly as many people thought that vaccination is bad, but they just didn't know what they were talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariel. And I will move on from the point that you stopped. There is no single serious legal expert or professor that would support it. And the implications of this judicial overhaul are very wide. They also have profound implications on the economy and its prospects. Without stealing the thunder from our next speaker, I can also say that when she concludes, she might even tell you there is no single serious economic professor in Israel or anywhere that would support what is happening here. And this is the most bothersome thing, that some are arrogant enough to push for legislation that have profound implications on every citizen in one way or another, not only without the knowledge, without consulting specific segments of society. At least Karnit and I can testify that the economists were not consulted, or at least those that we define as economists. So this brings me to our next speaker, Professor Karnit Flug, an honorary doctor from Tel Aviv University, participated in this symposium in the past, a professor at the Hebrew University, vice president for research in the Israel Democracy Institute, and as far as I'm concerned, the highlight, former governor of the Bank of Israel, the first woman to serve in this particular important role. So Karnit has been through quite a lot of storms because the world and Israel has faced a lot of storms in the economic sphere. So she was in office during what is called the Great Financial Crisis and its aftermath, and decades earlier, she was in the Bank of Israel very instrumental in building up the plan and the economic program for the absorption of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. So she comes with rich experience. Nothing can be summarized in 10 minutes, and therefore I will let you pick and choose the few points that would be appropriate for you. Tell us a little bit about the resilience, about are we ready for it, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacob. I think Senior Minister Tharman mentioned that we should be prepared for long-term trends that are part of what we're heading in the global economy and the global environment at large, and to shocks that are becoming more frequent and maybe more severe and are expected to continue. So I think what that should mean for a small open economy like Israel in a tough neighborhood, and how can we prepare for the long-term trends that we've already seen, but they're going to be more pronounced, and what can Israel do in order to prepare itself to withstand shocks that are global shocks, and maybe to prevent some local shocks. I think if you look at the experience of Israel over the last 15 years, you can see that it actually has demonstrated very strong resilience. And there was the global financial crisis, there was the COVID crisis, and the Israeli economy basically stood well through these crises with a relatively limited effect and with a very remarkable recovery. And part of what helped us being so resilient during this period is the strength of our institutions. And the institutions include the judiciary institution, the Bank of Israel, macroeconomic management that was quite impressive over these years, strong financial institutions that are well regulated. All of these basic institutions in Israel help us to go through the global shocks in a very good way. So the question is, how do we make sure that the Israeli economy continues to be resilient going forward? And here, one of the suggestions made by Tharman was prevent shocks. So here we actually come to the current situation where we not only prevent shocks, we actually have a homemade global shock that we are now thinking of what will be the results, the economic results and the social results and the results for the soul of this country of the shock that I'm obviously alluding to the judiciary overall or revolution. So following what was said by Professor Ariel Porat, I would like to talk a little bit about the economic consequences of this shock. And of course, we don't know yet how it will end. We know what was the intention of the coalition in terms of what the structure or the new structure of the judiciary and the Israeli institutions will be. And there was quite a lot written and analyzed about what would be the consequences if this judiciary overall goes through as planned. And I think I won't go through all the channels by which it can have an effect, but I think there is as was already mentioned by Jacob, there is a very broad consensus among Israeli economists and economists around the world, including some Nobel laureates that actually expressed their views about it, that the consequences can be very, very severe. The main channels are related to, first of all, to the general phenomena that when you don't have strong institutions, growth and prosperity are impaired. The sort of most direct channels is the tendency to invest in a country that doesn't have strong institutions is diminished. Capital investment, capital flow will be diminished. Israel is particularly dependent on foreign capital flow, and I'm sure that Chemi Peres will talk about the importance of foreign financing for the extremely important Israeli high tech, which has a very substantial part of the economy, and which is also very mobile. If the high techers, the brilliant people behind this sector will see that they cannot operate here, they are very attractive and they can go elsewhere very easily. If we look at the quantitative or the sort of attempts to quantify what would be the magnitude of the effect on growth in Israel if the current plans will actually, if the discussion at the president's office will not bear fruit and the coalition decides to legislate, so the order of magnitude of reduced growth, long-term growth in Israel is somewhere around or in the range of between 1% and 3%, or I would say that the sort of average of all the estimates that were made by the Ministry of Finance, by various parts of the Ministry of the Budget Office, the range or the average estimate is a reduction of 1.8% in the annual growth in Israel. If you take into account that the growth of population in Israel is about 1.8%, it will basically, and we know what the long-term growth in Israel is, it will basically mean that the Israeli standard of living will be completely stagnant. The growth of per capita income will be zero. And that means basically that we will go backwards instead of moving forward. So I think that the danger is very clear. I have to say that even if the legislation doesn't go through, the uncertainty that is now inflicting all the markets is already here, and we're already seeing the price in the share prices, in the risk premium that we're paying, and we've seen now that all the institutions that are following the Israeli economy are now downgrading the projections for the near future. So damage is already here, and the question is, to what extent it's reversible? Is there a chance that if an agreement is reached, things will be reversed? And what if an agreement in the discussions that are taking place about the legislation, if there is no agreement? So I think the only way to really stop the damage to the economy and reduce the uncertainty, if there will be a statement by the government that legislation will not be moved forward unless a broad agreement will be reached, and an agreement that will maintain the independence of the judiciary system. I think this is crucial, and it's the only way to avoid the bleeding of the economy that we've been seeing in recent months. Let me now move to one long-term trend and how Israel should or could be preparing for. And I'm thinking about maybe the biggest challenge for Israel is to meet the educational challenge that is posed by the changing world, by the changing technology, by AI that is already making a lot of our skills obsolete, and it will change the face of the global labor market and the Israeli labor market as well. And we know that there are already many tasks that are performed now by technology, and this will widen. Are we prepared for this challenge? I think the Israeli educational system is not prepared for the current labor market, and it's even less prepared for the future labor market. Our kids are performing very poorly in the standardized tests about their skills on literacy, on quantitative aptitudes, on even on digital skills. You know, we're the startup nation, but when you look at the scores of kids in the educational system in these areas, they're very poor. And what is even or not less troubling is that the variance is extremely wide. We have very large part of the population that don't get basic skills, and that's true not only for Arabs, not only for ultra-Orthodox, but a lot of kids in the periphery and who are coming for less advantaged families that cannot actually get the basic skills that are needed for the labor market today. So I think there is a need to overhaul our educational system. I'm sure we can learn a lot from Singapore in this area. Both in terms of the content, the way in which the schools operate, and providing the incentives for excellence, and in particular for excellent teachers that would go to the periphery and really help get these kids the basic education that can help them actually come to this university later on. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Karnit, for this both informative and sobering description. There is kind of a contrast because, you know, Karnit spoke about startup nation. In this university, there is a lot of effort put into innovations, which is the name of the game. And our next speaker, in fact, his second to last name is innovation. The third to last name is peace, but his true last name is Perez. And this is Chemi Perez, who is the managing partner and co-founder of Pitango, a very large, reputable, world-scale company, chairman of the Perez Center for Peace and Innovation. And, you know, success has many parents. Failure normally is orphaned. So the area of technology, high-tech, innovation has had a lot of claims to be, I'm the father, I'm the mother, I'm the cousin, I'm the whatever. But I think that there is no argument about the fact that in the top line of the founders of Israeli high-tech companies and entry into the global scene as a great success is Chemi Perez's activities. So we will not waste the opportunity by asking you only to tell us what do you think about the judicial revolution, which I'm sure you will, but also it's important to know how did we get from there to here. So tell us the story of the Israeli high-tech, where does it go, what are the challenges, and all of it in 10.5 minutes. Thank you. And I can tell you, knowing Chemi, he can do it.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And listening to President Porat's view on the situation and stand, I can tell you that as a graduate of the Tel Aviv University, I'm more proud than ever today. So thank you very much. Israel is a very special country, and it is special because it was blessed with nothingness. We have no land, we have no water, we have no oil, we have no shelter. And still, we managed to build an outstanding state against all the odds. For me, the story of the high-tech sector is really the story of Israel, and it is a story of the transformation in the world from land to mind. We never really relied on the land, but we relied on our mind. And our story begins with a beautiful vision of Theodor Herzl of what kind of a society and institutions we want to have as a people when we are reclaiming the state of Israel and rebuilding it into what it is today. He was followed by David Ben-Gurion, who started the second phase of innovation, which is settling down and innovating in water technologies, in agriculture, in energy, to build the establishment in the State of Israel. It continued into the third stage of innovation, which is about defense and security. Since we do not have a shelter, we do not have any valleys, we do not have any mountains or weather that can slow down invaders, we are exposed. We had to build a shelter made of brain power, starting with nuclear technologies, going into space and cyber, and Israel became a mighty force in the third stage of innovation. The fourth one really started when my father became prime minister for the first time, the 80s, and I'm sure that Professor Frenkel remembers those days, where the inflation rate reached 450% in mid-80s. The Israeli economy imploded because we are too small to be a market, we are too poor to be a provider, and our security burden is too harsh because we are surrounded by hostile enemies. So we had to turn again to our brain power and create the fourth step of innovation in our journey, which is building our economy based on science and technology. We are now entering the fifth stage of innovation, which I will keep for the second part of the speak. Today, Israel has about 7,000 startup companies which are innovating for the world. We never innovated for ourselves. We always address global challenges, global opportunities, because we don't have a local market and we don't have a regional market. So we have to be global from day one. We innovate in every transformation of the digital wave, in every industry, every step of the way. And in the last 10 years, we actually experienced tremendous growth from 2012 to 2021. Our investment pace in technology grew from $3 billion a year to $26 billion a year. Thank you. With less than 10% of the labor force, we generate more than 50% of export and more than 15% of our GDP. But it all really started 3 decades ago. In the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, this is when I became a venture capitalist investing in technology for the last 3 decades. Our first decade can be described as a decade of technology. We did not have the money to grow companies. We did not have the experience to build global enterprises. So we just simply build technologies that we can introduce to global players who can then take those technologies into the market. Between 1990 and 2000, the Israeli culture in innovation was a culture of exit. I'm building technology and I'm selling it. In 2000, when the bubble burst, the internet bubble burst, and the telecom crisis appeared, we understood it's not enough to build technology, we must transform them into businesses. So between 2000 and 2012, we actually tried to build a business around the technology that we created. In 2012, something really magical happened in Israel. Tremendous amounts of money started to flow in the world, understanding that the world is moving from an old world of land and natural resources to a new land of technology and innovation. Interest rates went down, and liquid assets became unliquid assets by investing in growth assets, such as high-tech companies and funds that are investing in technology. That was a golden era for Israel because we increased the investment in Israel dramatically. It was an era of building unicorns. More than 100 companies in Israel gained a valuation of more than $1 billion, but more importantly, they started to generate real revenues. And if you add to that the amounts of money that were raised in the stock markets, they mobilized tens of billions of dollars to drive the Israeli economy forward. The problem with the judicial reform, as it is called, is that it is jeopardizing probably the best opportunity Israel ever had. We're entering now the 4th decade of technology innovation in Israel. And I can tell you that the entrepreneurs that I'm meeting on a daily basis earned for the first time a ticket to compete on a global basis and enter the distinguished club of Fortune 500 companies. We're not selling our companies early. We know how to get to global markets. We know how to manage companies, and we know how to raise capital. But all these 7,000 companies and all these $25 or $26 billion of international investment in Israel, and more than 90% of them are international funds, have to be invested in few thousands of people that are the core essence of the high-tech sector, the geniuses, those that have been innovating in the Israeli Defense Forces, those that were innovating in sustainability. They cannot do what they are supposed to do unless there is a democracy, unless there is a freedom, unless there is liberalism. Thank you. The Israeli high-tech sector is not going to go anywhere. And the global investors will continue to invest in Israeli entrepreneurs. But the question will be, is Israel going to enjoy the full potential of building such great companies, or are we going to transform these companies and exile them into other territories? My father said once that in Israel we have basically three elites. We have the farmers and the builders. We have the warriors and the defenders. And then we have the scientists and the engineers. The problem is that the first two elites are connected to the land. Farmers have to grow their farms on the land. Defenders need to defend the land. But scientists and innovators and technologists, they can be anywhere. So the reform today, unless it is stopped completely and reversed, is going to cause the greatest damage in Israel economy in our history of short 75 years. There is no way to go back to where we were before the reform started. It has to end somewhere else. Any reform, especially such a reform that is covering the three branches or the two branches as described here, is something that takes years, and it has to have broad agreement. It cannot be compromised because we cannot compromise values. We have to find a shared way. For me, Israel is like a train that rides on two rails. One is Jewish, but the other is democratic. When there is an attempt to tear off one of those rails, the train will fall over. So this is not a political issue. The political move by the government to diminish the power of the Supreme Court is political, but the reaction is a civil one. It crosses all parties, because at the end of the day, it's the future of Israel as a democratic state. And I'm afraid that when the best entrepreneurs in Israel will wake up one morning and they will have to ask themselves, do I live in Israel or do I live in a democratic state? And the choice is not the same. That will be the point where there will be the biggest migration of the biggest asset of Israel ever will be transformed outside of our borders. So we have to stop the reform, we have to terminate it, and we have to agree. Thank you. And we have to agree that we're not going to compromise. We're going to sit down and reach a broad agreement out of which our system will be stronger and more robust. So we can never, ever make Israel non-Jewish on one hand or non-democratic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chemi. Let me make a few remarks. If there is one common theme that we heard time and again, that we have a lot to lose. It's a high-stake gamble. Even in Las Vegas, you don't take these odds. So it's not good enough to say that there is a chance, a small probability, and all of this. but there is also a chance that it does not work. And I think that is the unanimous view of experts that we should not take this chance. Second, it's not good enough to say at some stage they will see the light. Because as Tharman told us, in the modern world, processes and crises are non-linear. When suddenly it bursts, you cannot put the genie back to the bottle. Especially when it comes to foreign investors who are not having neither patience nor tolerance to examine and re-examine on whatever. They look at us through a telescope and they say something is murky and don't bother me with the details of the microscope. I don't want this kind of thing. And we know for a fact that literally the day the new proposals were aired, foreign investors and domestic investment fell, period. We know of commitments that were made to come and invest in funds, in companies, in whatever, that were stopped at the border, so to speak. People say, not yet. We will wait for better days. But the fence that, or the wall that separates us from them is thin. You cannot sit on the fence for too long. If you don't come here, you go somewhere else. But once you go somewhere else, that's where taxations are being collected, that's where your children are being born, and that's where things are there. So irreversibility is the key issue, which means time is of the essence. Therefore, people say, well, why do you worry? It has not yet been implemented. But as you know, when it comes to financial markets, capital markets, economics, investments, it is not what has happened, but what you expect will happen, even with a low probability. And therefore, when people say, well, I'm suspending it for now, cross the word for now, replace the word suspending with the word eliminating, then you will see suddenly how huge burst is coming to unlock itself. And I said it earlier, it is sheer arrogance to ignore the strong views of experts from all over the world, well-wishers, and not biased. Our president mentioned that we are going, that for the first time he was joining a protest, in fact, calling us to do the same. In fact, this is true to everyone that is sitting on the stage. I've never joined a protest, but there is no single Saturday night that I'm not going to be there, that I'm not there. And in fact, many, many months ago, maybe 4 or even more, Karnit and I were contemplating what should be our public posture. And we decided completely uncharacteristically to write a long op-ed that was published in the front page of the daily paper, and it really, for us, was a relief. We are now free to express our views because those are professional views. We have no aspirations to be in politics, and as you know, when you are long enough in business, you are being cast into, you are a leftist, you are a rightist, you are this or you are that. So I can tell you personally, I was nominated and appointed by a very right-wing government, Shamir. I was second reappointed by a very right-wing Prime Minister, Netanyahu. Along the way, I had the pleasure of being appointed and working with Shimon Peres, with Yitzhak Rabin, with Arik Sharon, and frankly, none of them knew if I voted for them or not, and they never asked. Today, you would be asked, or people would necessarily, would actually cast you into this or that. So that's why, because it is such a deemed, such a terrible picture, which makes me optimistic, paradoxically. Because if you go in the streets of Saturday night and you see the dynamism, you see the energy, you see the hundreds of thousands of people going, wrapping themselves with a flag, young children, grandchildren, parents, everyone, you say it's inconceivable that this will fail. It will succeed. So we are now talking about the timing, and the next item on the agenda is suspension. Delay is not good enough. Burial is the right solution. Thank you very much, my friends. I want to thank all the participants in this panel. It seems like we have run over time, but this is what life is about, making choices and seizing opportunities. And now that you are captured audience, you were stuck. But thank you, President Porat, for hosting us. Thank you, Governor Karnit Fluk. Thank you, Chemi Peres. And mostly, thank you and congratulations to Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who tonight will be awarded the George Wise Medal. Thank you again.